just us. Justice. Justice first. I'm Queen Zakia Shabazz. Pronoun me. I'll be your moderator this morning, this afternoon, this rainy Saturday afternoon. On this leg of the Justice First tour. So let's get started. Our panelists today, we're going to be talking about criminal justice, environmental justice, LGBTQIA justice, and academia, higher education justice, or injustices in those areas. The particular justice that I fight for personally is United Parents Against Lead. We advocate on behalf of children who have been poisoned by lead, and particularly those who are drinking leaded water in public schools, in their homes. We want to prevent another Flint. Going to ask a question of our panelists. Asking each one of you to briefly introduce yourself. I believe the mic is on here. And the first question is, what does the intersection of your, are you joining us, brother? Thank you. With anyone else, we have another seat. Anyone else brave enough to come on up? What's your name, sir?
Rodney Hunter.
Rodney Hunter, welcome. And what would be your justice area, Brother Hunter?
Yeah, living wage, Medicaid expansion, housing.
Okay, great, excellent. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to start down here with my sister, Bakura Shabazz. Please introduce yourself briefly and tell us what your justice area, and answer the question. This is the question for the panelists. What does the intersection of your justice area or areas and justice look like?
Okay. See if I can remember that at a time. I'm going to my little spiel. As Sister Shabazz said, my name is Bakura Shabazz. I am the founder and CEO of First Alliance Consulting Firm, a communal-based consulting business that focuses on community issues and solving those issues with community members. I am also employed by Virginia Conservation Network as a climate organizer, which I'm extremely happy about, coming over into environmentalism after spending 20 years doing criminal justice advocacy reform. Seeing the intersections between the two and being able to make those correlations is very important to me when it comes to fighting for marginalized and impacted communities and peoples. So I'm also a member of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative and the Virginia Prisoners of Conscience group that focuses on prison reform and amplifying prisoners' voices from within. Can I get that question one more time, Sister Shabazz?
Yes, ma'am. What does the intersection of your issue area or areas and justice look like? What does the intersection of your areas and justice look like?
For me, growing up in downtown Newport News and finding out really late in my life the environmental hazards that myself and my family was exposed to, I was devastated. And the fact that so many others did not know made me even more furious. Having a son that is disabled from chronic severe asthma, another who suffers with chronic bronchitis, and another that suffers from exercise-induced asthma. And seeing the economic hardships that I had to go through as a single parent, and not having a government that was being responsible to and for me, since they exposed me and my family to these elements, made me want to start to do more. And once you start putting out this information, and it's important that you be with a group of people, because I was a lone wolf, and so I was an easy target as I started to expose these injustices in my communities. And when I mean a target, I mean police started coming, fake charges started to come in. It was, and still is, horrible. So when people tell you these stories about they're now being a target, don't be so dismissive to what they're saying and thinking that they're going nuts. It is really, really happening. People are being targeted for exposing the truth. And so it's important that we surround people who are willing to take these risks and stand up for them. So what justice would look like for me is having a responsible government that is going to be transparent in every way possible, and don't feel like there's anything that they cannot share with the public, because we all bear these burdens together. And so we are stakeholders in not only the state of Virginia and in the cities that we live in, but in the nation. So by saying you try to keep me from something is not responsible. We are all adults, and we all have to put into ensuring that we have a planet that is sustainable, that we have education, food, and everything else that we all need to be okay.
Thank you, Sister Bakura. Christian Reed.
Hi, my name is Krista. Thanks so much for having me here. I teach at Virginia Commonwealth University in a kind of interdisciplinary general education program. And when I'm not at VCU, I spend a lot of time working in what I will reluctantly call criminal justice reform, and I'll talk about that reluctance in a second. I've worked as a volunteer service provider in reentry since about 2009, and I worked for a number of years starting in about 2010 or 2011 as a teacher in correctional institutions. So I taught at the old Richmond City Jail, and then when we migrated to the new Richmond City Justice Center, I followed the programs through over to that new facility. And so there's a lot of things I could say about how criminal justice reform fits into what we're talking about here today. And I think I want to start a little bit by talking about scale, but also about the ways that we become enculturated to a system of incarceration. So I think probably we already know in this room that we incarcerate in the US the largest number of people that are incarcerated in the world. And that's true for just raw numbers and for percent population. We have about 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. And I think when you incarcerate a quarter of the people in the world, you actually live in an environment in which carceral systems become functionally invisible. Even if you feel actually really attuned to that system, even if you feel opposed to that system, you live in an environment built structurally around this system. So when I teach this on campus, the example I give my students who come into a diverse public urban university, they feel very politically progressive, they feel kind of woke, they come into class and they're like, you can't tell me about prisons, Dr. Reed. And I'm like, okay, so I think probably we're politically aligned, but I actually think Virginia's incarceration system is functionally invisible to you. And the one way that's maybe makes this most materially real for my students is when I tell them that every single piece of furniture at VCU, and in fact in any state institution in Virginia, any state college or university, but also in our legislative buildings, is built by incarcerated labor in our state. And from my perspective, that means that's built by enslaved labor, because we in the state of Virginia don't pay people for their work while they are incarcerated. And so for my students, that's sometimes a little bit hard to internalize, because they see themselves as politically opposed to incarceration. They see themselves as politically opposed to enslavement of other humans. But actually, these are things that we are so enculturated to that we live with them every day. We sit in those chairs, we eat off those tables. It's actually part of our actual life. It's part of our life. We've all become really dependent on it. And so I think one of the things I want to contribute to today's conversation is to encourage us to find emotional and psychological space to actually understand the real scale of the problem in the US. We don't just incarcerate on a mass scale. We actually have an institution in the United States that is unprecedented in human history. And I think that's really, really important to understand. So just this week, the Vera Institute, which I love, they do great research on incarceration policy. They take a really progressive stance on criminal justice reform. They released a report indicating that we've seen about a 1% decrease in our incarceration rates over the last couple of years. And this is the kind of report that puts me in a position of not knowing how to respond socially. Because on the one hand, any one individual that I could keep out of a prison, I would, right? Like I would sort of, as a person, do anything to keep any person out of a prison. And 1% of people at our incarceration rates is actually a huge number of people. But I think that we can get trained to see something as reform that is actually quite regressive. And I think a 1% decrease in our incarceration rates is just profoundly insufficient. I think for us to even say that we were moving towards a reasonable scale of decarceration, and I think this is going to sound like many people, even people working in criminal justice reform would say that this is going to sound a little extreme, but I think we would have to start by looking at a 50% decrease. I think if we could cut our incarceration levels in half today, I would then feel comfortable saying, okay, now we simply incarcerate too many people. So I think a little bit I want us to kind of like work on understanding what our scale is and work on where we are. And to get to this question about how I see criminal justice reform relating to the question of justice is I think precisely because criminal justice reform has the word justice and reform in it, is we can be given things under the banner of reform that we should not be accepting. So I'll give one quick example and then I'll move on. And you'll cut me off if I run too long, right?
Yeah.
Because I get started on prisons and I tell you what, it's like never over. So just this year, out of this legislative session, Governor Northam signed legislation that raised the felony threshold in Virginia from $300 to $500. So felony larceny in Virginia is now at $500. And for some people, this was celebrated as reform. We increased our felony threshold. No, I think that this is unacceptable as reform for two reasons. Number one, $500 is still too low, way too low. Still some of the lowest in the nation. But second, this was a compromise deal set with the more conservative wing of our leadership in Virginia that campaigned to tie probation to repayment of restitution. So probationary officers in the state of Virginia are now empowered to collect restitution to the state or to victims as part of a condition of probation. Restitution can be thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. People who are released from prison are not permitted to drive, and they face really severe restrictions in employment and housing. So what this functionally does is it places people exiting carceral institutions in Virginia on a perpetual state of probation that they are not empowered to escape. And because probation creates opportunities for incarceration by criminalizing otherwise legal behavior like missing a drug test, missing a probationary appointment, not getting a job, we're actually putting those people at perpetual risk of reincarceration. And because completion of probation is a prerequisite for voting rights in the state of Virginia, we are perpetually disenfranchising people through this system. So this reform that we have gotten this year from our legislative offices is actually a profound win for our carceral state and a profound loss for any campaign for reform. So I want to encourage us as we think today about how our issues are related to also think about how we get these reforms that are really marketing for the same systems that we already have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian Reed. Next up is the Lamnick.
Thank you.
Yes.
I am honored to be on this panel with some exciting people who are doing incredible work in the community. So thank you. It's an honor to be here with all of you as well. I am the Deputy Director of Equality Virginia. Equality Virginia is a statewide LGBT organization working for fairness in Virginia. So we are based in Richmond, but we do statewide advocacy work. A lot of people who know us think about the work that we do in the General Assembly. And in a lot of ways, it feels really inaccessible to folks. Most of us, I think, and I will speak for myself too, before I started at Equality Virginia 5 years ago, my understanding of kind of like the legislative process was about schoolhouse rock level, right? You know, how the song about how the bill becomes the bill. So it's a challenge to invite people to become engaged in the legislative process. And a lot of our work is providing people with the tools that they need to find their voice, to feel comfortable and empowered to speak truth to their power at the General Assembly. It is perfectly legal right now in Virginia to be fired or not hired for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And I do education and trainings across the state, and most people are surprised by that and think that protections are already in place to protect gay and transgender people, not only from protections in the workplace, but also you can be denied housing or kicked out of an apartment for being gay or transgender. You can be kicked out of a public space for being gay or transgender. So there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of misconception and a lot of lack of education around the protections that are in place. What's exciting is that most people believe that you should be protected on the basis of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. Most people believe that you should be able to provide a living for your family, put a roof over your family's head. And a lot of that has to do with our shared kind of American values. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is really focusing on elevating trans visibility. Right now in America, there are studies that show that about 9 out of 10 people know somebody who is lesbian or gay or bisexual. In fact, if everybody raised their hands in this room, I'm sure we'd see quite a percentage of people, right? Right? Awesome. If we did the same, we could say the number of hands would be very different if I asked how many people know somebody who's transgender. And that's about 1 out of 10 nationally, actually. So you all are doing much better than this. So a lot of our work is to increase trans visibility because we know that the more people who support trans issues, who know somebody who's trans, will then support trans issues. And we saw that with the lesbian and gay movement, right? So we know that a lot of people now know somebody who identifies as being lesbian or gay, and we see there being a lot more support for the lesbian and gay community. We don't have that level of support for the trans community. So a lot of our work is focused on elevating the voices and stories of transgender people. One of my favorite programs that we do at Equality Virginia is our Transgender Advocacy Speakers Bureau program. It is comprised of trans folks from across the state of Virginia with varying identities, who are veterans or who are people of color, who are mothers, who are IT professionals all across Virginia, and they simply go into mostly faith communities actually and share their stories. So they're not doing a gender identity 101, they are simply saying, hey, my name is Max, I am an advocate for great food, I ran a marathon last year, I just published a book of poetry, and I'm also transgender. And guess what? I'm your neighbor. I go to that Kroger up the street. I go to your church, et cetera, et cetera. So really helping to grow understanding and support for the trans community simply by getting to know another person. We are bound by our stories, I think, as humans, and so that's a big part of that program. So yeah, I could go on and on, I think, but I'm going to pass the microphone.
Thank you. Dee Magnus. And next up is Travis Williams. Welcome, Travis.
Thank you. So I'm Travis Williams. I teach sociology at VCU. I'm an environmental sociologist. I teach classes on environmental racism. I also teach broader classes just on sociology. But I'm here today, what I wanted to talk about just briefly actually came in part out of some conversations I had with my friend Bakura just about general issues of justice, academia, social inequality, etc. And since it's such a broad area, there's really just kind of 3 things I'm going to try to touch on. One, I'm going to talk about the model of the neoliberal university and the social violence that is attached to that. I'm also going to talk about the whiteness of the environmental humanities and social sciences really briefly. And then I want to talk a little bit about just thinking about justice critically and kind of the role that the university can play in that. So really quickly, since neoliberalism is sort of a really loaded term, what I'm talking about when I say neoliberalism is actually borrowing from a guy named David Harvey who wrote a lot of books on it. But just kind of in a nutshell, just talking about kind of mass deregulation, privatization, corporatization, the systematic withdrawal of the state from public sectors, and entrepreneurialism is kind of a core societal ideology, and the whole idea of kind of creating private markets for public goods. And in the context of the university, some of the things that are sometimes associated with this, just if you think generally about the kind of corporatization of everything, as I said before, mass privatization, withdrawal of the state, increasing financial burdens on student families, increasingly vulnerable faculty, and a lot of increased pressure, productivity pressure of various kinds, whether it's research, teaching, legitimacy, validation, etc. Ever-increasing class sizes, larger student-teacher ratios, aggressive administration expansion, racialized educational inequality, the kind of systematic abandonment of the liberal arts, aggressive pursuit of narrow, sort of STEM-focused fields, which aren't bad fields, but I'm thinking just about the broader dynamics. As well as the displacement of, increasing displacement of critical oppositional thinking by more productive, efficient thinking. So that's just sort of a starting point. And one of the general ideas that I just want us to think about in this conversation, which I think connects to a lot of other things, I think we have a lot of overlap in what we're talking about today, all of us, is that it's important for us to acknowledge, confront, and constructively challenge the complicity of the contemporary neoliberal university model with racial, cultural, and economic violence, and also to connect these institutional forms of marginalization and oppression with broader societal patterns of racial, cultural, economic violence within which the contemporary neoliberal university functions. And these include environmental inequality, environmental racism. So those were two at the top. One of the topics, the first of the triparts I think I'm trying to do here. So I also wanted to mention too, transdisciplinary whiteness and critical knowledge in the environmental humanities and social sciences. And that came largely from just my experiences at various conferences, especially large conferences around my discipline and so on, and concerns about the lack of diversity expressed even within the fields themselves in a lot of the environmental sort of humanities. And what was interesting to me, one of the experiences that I had, is that there was a survey that was given to a large section of a professional organization that's associated with my field, and they kind of admitted that there was this diversity problem that, and I noticed it too, just every year I'd be in the room and there'd be maybe 100 people and there's 1 or 2 African Americans, and this is also happening even as studies of minority issues and environmental issues are increasing, not really seeing a parallel expansion of experts, scholars, teachers with that increasing emphasis on racial diversity. There's also continued marginalization of indigenous and ethnic studies perspectives, as well as non-white scholars within these environmental fields. And one of the responses to a survey that was given by a lot of people who were part of this section, including very successful people, was that they were kind of very dismissive of the racial issue. They felt like, well, there's racism everywhere, why is this important? Or I'm not a person of color, I can't even really answer these survey questions. And there's also been within my field kind of a documented pattern of minority students who will enter the field but then kind of fall off, or they end up going into other fields as well. And so that's just something that's an experience that I've had, because it also raises the question of, what does it mean, or what might be the implications if we don't really have necessarily diversity at the level of expertise, authority, etc., even as we're expanding studies and analyses of marginalized groups. And so environmental inequality, environmental racism, these kind of remain enduring problems, even as the study of these problems increases within the academies, within the universities, for a variety of reasons. We don't really see a lot of parallel diversity. And I can say a lot more about those things, and I'm happy to if people have more specific questions like, what do I mean when I say this term, or what exactly am I referring to when I speak about patterns. But in terms of justice, I think one thing that I would like to have some time to do today is to think about what we mean by justice, and what kinds of justice are we interested in pursuing. And that comes in part from being influenced by one of my colleagues. His name is Jill Harrison. She's not really around here, but she's someone I went to graduate school with out in California in Santa Cruz, where I did my graduate work. And she did a lot of research on the environmental justice movement and really trying to highlight how folks involved in the EJ movement aren't just pointing out kind of, is justice there or not, but they're also oriented towards particular ideas of justice and challenging dominant ideas of justice that may actually not be all that progressive when we really start unpacking it. So one thing I've always been interested in, not just from an academic perspective, but just as someone who's also been involved with community projects and so on, is to think about what do we mean by justice? What kinds of definitions of justice are we interested in? And rather than thinking about this idea of we either have justice or we don't, but to really think also what sorts of justice are we interested in pursuing and what sort of dominant ideologies do we see functioning in terms of what people seem to be either saying explicitly or implicitly. What are they implying is justice? And are these types of justice that we're interested in? And what kind of unique contributions can the EJ movement and other social justice movements make towards really thinking critically about the kinds of justice agendas that we want to pursue, and also challenging existent agendas that maybe either claim or imply some sort of notion of justice and fairness that may not always be aligned with the ultimate goals that we're interested in. So yeah, I hope we can talk more about these things, and I look forward to the discussion.
We certainly will. We're going to have audience Q&A after the second question. Thank you so much, Travis Williams. And next up is Rodney Hunter.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a special thanks to Kendall for inviting me. My name is Rodney Hunter. I'm a minister at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church, and also just come on board as co-director of Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. And also, I guess, since I'm a preacher, Kendall told me I got 2 minutes, so let me use my 2 minutes well. I want to thank Reverend Leo for talking about justice first, and justice focus, and also I want to acknowledge Dr. Boykin Sanders in the back, professor here at Virginia Union. You were talking about justice. For me, and I wrote down justice. For me, defining justice, I was saying justice for me is rectifying the gross social inequities of the disadvantaged. It puts an end to the conditions that produce injustice. The oppressed are raised, and the oppressors are judged. This country has never been about justice for all. And to me, that's why it's such an important issue, and that's why we have to fight so hard on it. And we are still dealing, I think the professor said it, the issue of slavery. It's still slavery. Slavery made life easy for the few, and that's just institutional slavery. And for me, that's why when you ask me, I said a living wage for all. I think our jails, incarceration comes from people with lack of funds. When we talk about dignity and the quality of life and making sure persons can feel good about taking care of their children. How can you have dignity when you're making $7 an hour? When you have no health benefits? That's why Medicaid expansion is a part of what I think is important for the issue of justice. And you can't talk about, it's something about Noam Chomsky, I think, made it clear when he talked about this country wants to manufacture what they call consent, make you think that it's your fault because you're in the situation you're in. No, it's systemic, and that's what we're all saying. That means we do have to come together. We all have to come together for issues, not just my issue, but all issues. I think we have to come together to make sure that we win this battle that's fought with money on one hand, and so many of us are so overworked when it comes to the poverty area that we just can't always be everywhere all the time. But more of us can be in the battle. That's why for me, being a minister and being with the Interfaith Center plays a part, because when you talk about not knowing the parliamentary issues and not knowing all of the issues of the General Assembly, but there are people who do know. And if we can come together with those who do know, and they can educate us, then we can fight. And that's why, to me, that's why I'm here, to make sure that we end this oppressive system of keeping people down. The minorities, immigrants, and then look how they divide us. We're so divided. We need to come together and let them know that power does belong to the people. We're paying salaries to persons when they get in office, they become filthy rich. And then tell us why. Well, why do they need health care? This is absurd. And to me, that's why I'm here to say that, yes, I will fight until death. And we talk about fighting war somewhere else, and we don't have any kind of justice and freedom in our own country. So I'm here for that. The living wage piece, Medicaid expansion, incarceration, everything ties in. So I'm here to say that I'm with you in this fight for justice, and I'm willing to not just talk about it, but I'm willing to put any resources I have and to make physical sacrifices, because if we're talking about the next generation, we need to set an example for them. That's why.
Our next and final question before we take questions from the audience is, what would it look like to put justice first and work in greater solidarity across issues?
What would it look like to put justice first? That is a complex question depending on who you are. And I had a conversation about inclusion and equity. And I was on a conference call and I was talking about the issues that my people face. And the Spanish young lady said to me, well, you're not being very inclusive. And she was absolutely right. But I couldn't be, because my people are facing so much peril and we are dying every day. And it seems like this country could not care less about every day that somebody else in the street dead. And other cultures are not experiencing that. So my exclusion is not deliberate. It's just that I have to deal with what's going on with my people right now. And I don't know what's going on with other people's issues. And so if I don't know, I can't even lend a hand. So what we all have to do, as the Reverend said, because every inhumane issue is all of our issues, is that we can't assume that somebody is being a said thing or unsaid thing